Hello, my name is Connor Clement. In this review, I'm going to be comparing the Nikon 16 to 35mm lens to the Nikon 14 to 24mm lens. Now what I'm going to be doing in this review is I'm going to be talking about my first thoughts on the lenses, how they feel and how they perform and how their build quality is. And then the next thing I'm going to do is compare some of the sample images that I took with both of these lenses together to see, compare image quality a little bit. And then after that I'm going to talk about how these lenses perform in the field and what I believe the purpose of each of these lenses are. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the look and feel of the lens. Starting with the 16 to 35mm, it has a very sleek look, not too many buttons, not crowded at all. What I really like about this lens is how nicely spread apart the focusing ring and the zoom ring is on this lens. Now the 14 to 24mm has a great feel as well. The rings are very smooth, and the focus ring is very easy to grab, and once again it's very sleek looking, not too many knobs or buttons or anything like that. But what about when it comes to build quality? What I originally believed was that these would both have similar build quality. Well, in reality, the 16 to 35mm feels a little bit more cheaply made, and it just feels plastic, more plasticky, and the focus ring is not quite as smooth as the 14 to 24mm focus ring is. It's much more easy, it's just nicer to turn, and a little bit smoother, and it does feel a lot more solid than the 16 to 35mm lens. But you know, that's just the feel of the lens. That doesn't necessarily mean the build quality of the 16 to 35mm is worse than the 14 to 24mm lens. Now, the 14 to 24mm also has a faster f-stop, an f-stop of 2.8, whereas the 16 to 35mm only has an f-stop of 4. So this lens is built for more low-light photography, and it's probably better for those situations, whereas this is probably better for something like landscape photography, where you have to stop down a little bit. The advantages to the Nikon 16 to 35mm are that it is lighter, substantially lighter. There's a huge difference in the weight between these lenses. You know, it's also a lot easier to carry around in a bag without having a giant front element. And of course the other advantage of that is that it can take 77mm filters, whereas the 14 to 24mm can't really take filters at all. You'd have to buy a very special type of filter holder in order to put filters on it. Another thing is that the 16 to 35mm has a much more impressive range than the 14 to 24mm. 14mm is kind of a specialty range for, you know, it's just a very wide angle that distorts the image in interesting ways, so it's kind of a specialty type of lens, whereas the 16 to 35mm is a much more standard zoom range that gives you very ultra-wide images up to standard wide-angle images. This is a great range, especially for landscape photography, much better than 14 to 24mm lens. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to take these two lenses over to the computer, and we're going to watch ScreenFlow and compare the images taken with these two lenses. Alright, now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the image quality between the Nikon 16 to 35mm lens and Nikon 14 to 24mm lens. Now right here I have the 16 to 35mm lens at its maximum aperture of f-stop 4. We're going to take a look at center sharpness and compare these two. This is at 16mm f-stop 4. Here's the 14mm at f-stop 2.8. Now there's not a dramatic difference, but believe it or not, the 14mm does look actually a little bit sharper than the 16mm wide open. And the 14mm is actually at f-stop 2.8, whereas the 16mm is at f-stop 4. Now, although there is a slight difference, the difference is not huge. It's not very noticeable unless you're looking up very close to an image. So other than that, you probably wouldn't notice it. Now, what about the corners here at these large f-stops? Here we've got the 16mm at f-stop 4. And here's the 14mm at f-stop 2.8. Once again, not really that much of a difference. And the 14mm is actually a full stop larger here, and you still don't see a huge sharpness difference at all. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to compare the 16mm at f-stop 4 to the 14mm at f-stop 4. Now they've got the same f-stop, and we're going to take a look at center sharpness and corner sharpness. Here's the 16mm at f-stop 4. And here is the 14mm at f-stop 4. Now we see a big difference in the sharpness actually. The 16mm is noticeably softer in the center than the 14mm is at f-stop 4. Although once again, it's not a huge difference. It's not something you would really notice in a print size. It'd have to be a very large print to notice the difference. Now what about the corner sharpness? Here we have 16mm f-stop 4, 14mm at f-stop 4. Once again, the sharpness in the corners is better on the 14 to 24mm lens when they are at the same f-stop. You can definitely see it's quite a bit sharper. We'll take a look at this corner too. Here's the 16mm, 14mm, 16, 14. And you can still see that it is slightly sharper, although it is definitely a little more noticeable in this corner here between the 16 and 14mm lenses. Now after that, as we increase in f-stop, the sharpness is pretty much the same between the two lenses. All in all, the image quality of 14 to 24mm you could say is technically better than the 16 to 35mm lens, especially when they're at the same f-stop of 4. But once again, the quality is pretty close. It's not a substantial difference. Really, what choosing between these lenses depends on how you like to take your pictures, whether or not you like to take them in ultra low light situations or ultra wide, or whether or not you're more of a landscape photographer and want a better zoom range than the 14 and 24mm. That's really what it's all about with these two lenses, not really about sharpness or anything like that, because these two lenses come pretty close in terms of sharpness. Now, I did only show the wide angle size of both these lenses, but I did check out at the far end too, the 24mm and 35mm portions. And once again, the 24mm does perform a little bit better than the 16 to 35mm at 35mm, just like it did at 14mm. But once again, the differences aren't that noticeable. And that is a little bit of the image quality between the 16 to 35mm and 14 to 24mm lenses. Alright, now I'm going to talk about what it was like to work in the field with these two lenses and the purposes for these two lenses. Now once again, I find that these two lenses, for most people, will serve two completely different purposes. For landscape photographers, the choice is easily, most likely, the 16 to 35mm lens has just got an awesome range for landscape photography, and you know you don't really need the f-stop of 2.8 because you really stop down anyway, and of course this lens is just as sharp pretty much as the 14 to 24mm lens. So you get a great lens with a great zoom range. It's perfect for landscape photography. Now the 14 to 24mm lens is kind of a tricky one because once again, like I said, it's more of a specialty lens because it gets so wide. You can use this lens for landscape photography. I personally like this lens better for landscape photography, but that's because I like ultra wide angles. I like using 14mm about 90% of the time with my images because it's kind of like my style for taking landscape images. It's something that's recognizable in images and makes my images a little more unique because I like to take landscape images at such wide angles. But for most people, the standard wide angle of 16 to 35mm is a much better choice for landscape photography. Probably what most people would consider this lens for, in my opinion, would be for low light sports photography, low light ultra wide angle sports photography. You see a lot of neat images taken with this lens like that, and of course this lens is perfect for that because not only is it fast, but it's tack sharp, even all the way open at f-stop 2.8. And this has been a comparison between the Nikon 16 to 35mm lens and Nikon 14 to 24mm lens.